Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about the stages of FI, the checkpoints of FI. Really, we're just kind of putting this together. It's content that we've discussed a very, very long time ago, but we're seeing it's something that in our community, a lot of people are talking about, just trying to figure out where they are on this path to financial independence. And while every individual's journey is going to be unique, I think that when you can move to a place where you are gamifying this process to some degree, can make it much more rewarding, and it can allow you to enjoy the journey a lot more. So with that, welcome to the Ultimate Crowdsource Personal Finance Show. This is Choose FI. All right, guys, very excited to dive into this week's episode. And to help me with this, I have my co-host Brad here with me today. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Jonathan, I'm doing quite well. And yeah, I love that word you used in there, gamify, right? That's what it feels like a lot of these like checkpoints and milestones. That's what it's all about. It makes it more fun, right? Like it makes the path to FI. We all love getting gold stars or little badges in some,
We're using
computer
gold
game.
stars for my son's potty training right now, for my daughter's potty training. Like, this is a tried and true method. If it works for a toddler, it certainly can still work for us adults as long as we frame it the right way.
It's all about the framing. It's
I
all
guess we
about the
could have
framing.
retitled the
But
episode "Potty Training for Financial Independence." It's
that has a nice ring to it. Definitely does. But no, we actually saw. It was funny. We saw a Facebook post recently, and actually, you pointed it out to me. And you're like, we should do an episode about this because Ryan in our Facebook group said, "Is anyone else losing track of all the different styles, levels of FI?" I recently saw a post talking about snowbird FI. And
what?
before that, it was barista FI. I'm pretty sure last week it was fee fi fo fum or something like that. In all seriousness, is there an infographic or a breakdown of all these levels of FI? And actually, Jonathan, you saw that I kind of pushed back on this a little bit. And I said, I don't really subscribe to any of these types of FI. Just do what works for you. There's no need to label it. And then I think you actually kind of pushed back on me, which is cool. So that's actually why we're doing this episode because there is that interplay. I think my kind of reflexive response is, oh come on, like barista fi, snowbird fi. How many of these things are we going to come up with? But to your point, like there is fun here, right? There's fun in having these things to shoot for, and that aspect I definitely agree with.
Yeah, these are those officially sanctioned terms for the financial independence community?
By the board of the fi community.
No, but I agree with you, and I think the reason I was pushing back a little bit was exactly that. Like, can we gamify this? I think that's what's at the heart of it. Can we gamify it? Can we keep it fun? What's amazing about the path to financial independence is we're not talking about this, 50-year slog, this idea of necessarily retirement where suddenly at the end, now you get to enjoy your golden years and there's nothing in the middle. Rather, it is kind of get rich quick-ish. It's a somewhat short to medium time period. It's an intermediate time period. And you can see results quickly, but only if you kind of have a sense for what you're watching for. Because, $10, $1,000 doesn't turn into $1 million overnight. Well, most of the time. So with that in mind, we thought we could kind of start with kind of a spectrum of people at different places. And one of the things that I thought we could do that'd be a little bit unique with this episode is to really try to weave stages of financial independence, which are kind of quantitative, with a few more qualitative measures or a few other things that you can do along the way to kind of fill in some of the space in between. So we could just say, all right, well, when you hit this net worth, that's a checkpoint. This net worth, then maybe there'll be a little bit of that in there. But what are the actions that you took that kind of changed the framework for you? And I think that gives us a little bit more room to work. So with that in mind, Brad, a lot of us, if we were to think back to kind of some of the early terminology that we heard in this community, one of the big ones that I remember you leaning on and Mr. Money Mustache leaning on was this idea, your hair is on fire. That being the way that you would frame, what is my current economic picture? What is my current plan for my life? When you're going to sum it up in a sentence, it's a hair on fire scenario. So why don't you kind of help our audience appreciate what that means? And then let's establish that maybe as, a starting place.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is a good starting place for a lot of people. I think, Jonathan, honestly, awareness fi, right? Just like awareness of your financial life. That might be, frankly, the first one. But let's start with hair and fire. So to me, this is all right. Things have reached that critical point. And whatever that means for you, that might mean I can't pay my bills this month. That might mean I have to ask for a loan from somebody, from a family member or a friend. That might mean I've maxed out my credit card. Or, it might be something slightly more pedestrian, like this is the first time I didn't save in a month. Like this is very personal. But to me, it's hair on fire is you've reached a point of that critical mass, however you define that. And I think, Jonathan, usually we say this is if you've got credit card debt. That's the most obvious one. We've talked about like, hey, if you are in a situation where you are digging a hole to the tune of 20 to 30% annual interest on a credit card, or worse, a payday loan, think of the worst possible things, right? But credit cards for most people, that's the standard, if you will, the standard level of hair on fire. And you're not at a steady state. You're not paying that off. You're just making the minimum payments, or, you keep adding every month. Like to me, that's okay, something catastrophic is going on. I need to fix this.
And I would say to your point about, awareness, it's almost when we're starting out, most people don't start out aware of the concept of financial independence. We usually start out because of some dissatisfaction with our current financial trajectory, and whether or not, um, if we were to kind of contrast these two, hair on fire is almost in a situation where you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's you're making one bad decision because the other decision was even worse. And you're like, I'm going to a really dark place if I stay on this path. I need to do something. In some cases, that is maybe even better than the other scenario because you're forced to shake out of it or to snap out of it more quickly. The other scenario that you could contrast that with is just drift. And this is what Dominic Cortuccio talks about all the time. We've had him on the show many, many times. It's just a state of lukewarm mediocrity. Everything's okay. It's not actually great. Actually, it's kind of bad and it's kind of getting worse month over month, but it's not bad enough to get you to do anything about it. You can make it work and you can stay on that path for decades because the perceived cost of making a change is too great, and you're if maybe comfortable. I don't know if comfortable is the right term or not, but you're not in enough pain to actually do anything about it. And so if you have these two stages, this drift state, this hedonic treadmill, this keeping up with the Joneses lifestyle, and you have this hair on fire scenario and you're running in parallel, that person with their hair on fire, you're running out of hair. You got to do something. And at some point, if we as a community do a better job creating awareness around this concept of financial independence, telling people that it's simple math, telling people that it's replicable, trying to highlight the best practices, we give maximum opportunity to people that are in these two various stages to make better choices, better decision making, and in the process reclaim decades of their life. And that is that point of awareness, which then comes with some steps that need to be made. But it's worth pointing out, Brad, this is really that moment that you can look back at and you said, because of that interaction I had, because of that conversation, I became aware of this concept and I went down the rabbit hole. And that really is where it starts.
Yeah, you're right. And when you're talking about drift, right? Like for so many people, it is that huge external event, that negative event that just kind of jolts them into it. But hopefully it doesn't take that, right? Hopefully it can take just a conversation with a friend or hearing a podcast or reading an article, right? And realizing like, oh wow, I need to wake up to this, right? Like going along that drift, right? It's just this societal conformity. It's just going with the flow, keeping up with the Joneses, all these cliches, right? But you can picture that in your head, what that looks like. And to your point, Jonathan, that can last for 20, 30, 50 years, right? Very, very easily. That can be an entire adult lifetime. And you would never have even been aware that there's something better out there. And that's why I know we say this a lot, but it really is incumbent on us as members of the financial independence community to look for friends and family members who we can possibly bring this message to. And I don't mean this in like a weird scammy kind of way. We've talked about it so many times, like the positive approach to take. But it really does make a difference. You can truly make a difference one person at a time, and it can spread, and it can make your community better, it can make the world better. And I know that sounds grandiose, but it's true. I mean, we've seen it. So, that said, that person hopefully is now aware. right? And they realize, okay, where do I start? And I think after awareness, Jonathan, it's all right, I have to start on this path to FI regardless of where I am, right? Like that person on day one, they could be in a hair on fire situation. They could be in steady state. They might have a positive net worth. They might have a 30% savings rate, right? Like that's the cool thing about this is you can start on day one in dramatically different spots. And again, like that's one of those things I find empowering about this. This is not a message just for people deeply mired in debt or just for people who have done this right from day one. This is for everybody, but it's about starting.
I think that is a great point in that not everybody is in a drift state. Not everybody has is in a state of hair on fire. But most of us, when we encounter this concept of financial independence, that's a really good place for us to then build on that. And then it's a framework of assessment. And I think there's two different things. And some people will say they have definitely done both of these. Maybe some people have done neither of them, which is going to make proceeding a lot more difficult because you just don't have all the data. But there's two different calculations that I think are very useful. The one is, how much does my life cost? How much does your life cost? And when you say that, I think some people immediately hear a budget, which is never a bad idea to do a budget. There's a lot of evidence, a lot of data to support doing a budget, but it's not even as critical that you do a budget as much as you simply know how much your life cost, and then you can build on that with what is the number I would need to be able to support my life for the rest of the time? What is my FI number? These are two pieces of data that we're going to use through the rest of the checkpoints of FI, and they're going to really inform this. So whether or not we want to build all sorts of checkpoints around creating a budget, creating an anti-budget, doing, or some modified version that just keeps things simpler, all that's fine, but you do fundamentally need to have a good sense of how much your life costs. And most of us, Brad, if we've been in a drift state, just spend right up to what we make and just a little bit over, and we make the minimum payments. And really, an exercise like this will give you some parameters for making forward progress.
Yeah, you're right. And so that is day one, right? That's day one is sit down and figure out, hey, what's coming in? What's my income? What's going out? What are my expenses? Theoretically on a monthly basis, but really over a year. Because as we say, life is lumpy, right? Like there are expenses that you'll see every year in June. But if you did a budget based on, hey, what were my expenses in March? That wouldn't have come up. Or we invariably know for many people, December is a significant expense month, right? So you need to factor all these things in. And, frankly, this is not easy. It's not fun, but you have to do it. You have to sit down and take a couple hours and just figure out, hey, roughly what does my life cost? It doesn't need to be to the penny, but just get a sense. And then for me, the other side of the coin is net worth, which is fancy accountant speak for, hey, what do I own, right? What are my assets? And what do I owe? What are my liabilities? And just real simply, you take your assets, you subtract out what you owe, your liabilities, and you get, hey, what am I worth? And for a lot of people, that's going to be pretty close to zero, maybe even negative. For many people, hopefully it'll be positive if they've been, putting money away in a 401k or some such, just maybe by sheer luck or somebody told them to. And it's just important to know where are you, because you can't move forward without that information.
And all that kind of comes together in terms of this general equation, right? What you earn minus what you spend is equal to a difference or a gap. And, we want to grow the gap. We want to increase our margin. And then whatever we do with the gap will probably have an increased level of outcome on how long it takes us to get to this point of financial independence. Are we going to invest the difference? Are we going to just go back and spend it? Are we going to, how are we going to invest it? Is it going to go into real estate? Is it going to go into the stock market? Is it going to go into ourselves to develop ourselves as a person to create more income in that regards? There's just kind of identifying what are these three different points on this personal equation of financial life, and then what impact can we have? And we've discussed that in other episodes. So we're not going to spend our time here today, but just understanding that now you know how much I make, and I know how much control I have over increasing my income, and I know how much I spend, and I know what level of control I have on what my expenses are. That's where a budget is helpful, and recognizing that not all expenses in terms of what you spend are the same. I mean, Brad, I'll give this back to you, but it's just worth pointing out there's core and structural expenses. This is going to be your shelter and maybe your utilities. But then there's also consumption expenses and there's obligations, things that we've obligated ourselves to, but they're not necessarily essential for us to live our life. So just thinking through what those are will help us as we actually start to map out what our life is going to cost and how close we are to approaching these various stages that we're about to get into.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I mean, for me, like we're talking about, this is day one. You're just trying to get a picture of where you are. But make no mistake, in order to pursue financial independence, you need to take action, right? And if you are someone who is at a point where you're not saving any money, or worse, you're getting into debt further and further every month, you're going to have to cut some things, right? Like that's just the way it works. Or obviously, you can raise your income. That's another as Jonathan said, it's that very simple equation for the gap, right? So you have some ways of looking at this, but the low hanging fruit is usually, hey, what in my life am I not getting value from, right? And that, while we do distinguish, Jonathan, like you said, between those kind of core slash structural expenses and discretionary, that implies, I think, a little stronger that the core and structural are just like stuck, right? Like some things that people think of as core expenses, which would be maybe automobiles, right? Or transportation or food, right? Like you still have a lot of leeway to impact what that costs for you, right? I mean, for me, our core expenses are basically just our utilities and our mortgage because we have no car payments, right? We have cut our food expenses, and now obviously there's almost no way to cut your food expenses down to zero, but we've cut them dramatically because we make home cooked meals. My wife Laura loves to cook. She meal plans. She buys at Costco in bulk and basically apportions things into our deep freezer. And she has all these like fun little strategies, right? Like, and that's a topic for a different conversation, obviously, but it's a way to cut your meal costs down from $5 to $10 a person per meal down to $2 or $3 per person per meal without sacrificing food quality. And I think that's just kind of a way to look at, hey, are there places in my budget, in my expenses that I potentially am not getting value from? And then, Jonathan, we're talking about like, hey, what are the stages of FI, right? What are the checkpoints of FI? I think we need to then, for that person on day one, and maybe this is, within the first month or so, is realize, all right, what is FI? What is that rough number of what is FI?
Right. So when you calculate, what is financial independence, the way you're going to do that, what is my financial independence numbers? We're going to find out how much does our life cost, recognizing that can change, right? And that even by going through this exercise, you might end up manipulating some of the cost of your life. And I don't mean manipulate in a bad way. I mean, you might realize that you are spending money in an inefficient manner, and you might tighten that up to make sure you're getting maximum value from each dollar. And that could change how much your life costs. So, but you could do the exercise either way. You could just look at what your life costs without judgment and without any intervention and say, here's what my life cost on a monthly basis. Track that over maybe a couple months, project that out to an annual cost. So based on my monthly spending over this season, I would anticipate that my annual cost is this. This is the annual cost of my life. Take that annual budget, that annual dollar amount, multiply that times 25, and that is your financial independence number. You have a good sense of how much money, if you were able to have this amount in an investment account, you would have a pretty good assurance that that would be the amount of money you could draw down, basically what your life cost every single year for the rest of your life, and likely die with a huge pile of money as well at the end of your life. That's roughly what we're talking about when we say the 4% rule, which is kind of, I just showed you the inverse of that. And then as another thought experiment, you could say, wow, now that I know how much my life actually cost, do I like what I'm spending money on? Would I want to make some cuts? Do I need to add some money to what I'm spending? Go either way with it. And you could come up with a range. So if I were to make these cuts, my life would only cost this. That's useful to know as well. These are the sorts of thought experiments that we can do right now, and we can create a general range for ourselves of, what our financial independence number is going to look like, what it is going to be. So I agree with you, Brad. Really, the very beginning of our journey, when we go from this kind of pre-financial independence stage where we're just doing whatever we're doing to now that moment of awareness, that moment of awakening, that point where we become aware of this concept and we start building towards that, this is going to happen. And now this can really dictate all the stages of FI and all the actions we take going forward because we're working towards this goal.
Yeah, agreed. And Jonathan, I just want to point out just real quick, you said you take your annual expenses and multiply by 25. So just to be clear, that's 25 times your annual expenses. I know that that might be obvious to us, but we are going to kind of drill down into probably half FI later or something like that, which would be 12.5 times your annual expenses. So I just wanted to make it clear for people who like math isn't their native language, right? Just this is a real simple calculation. Okay. It's just take your annual expenses, multiply by 25. And that gets you the net worth that you theoretically need to reach financial independence. Now, people of good faith can argue, is it actually 26 times? Is it 27? That's fine. We can put that aside for now. There's enough research behind the 4% rule, as Jonathan talked about, that we can feel safe calling this the 4% rule of thumb. Okay. So 25 times your annual expenses, that's a good guiding light. And that's where we are right now. This is a guiding light for I have reached FI when I get to 25 times.
Yep. Yeah. And I just, so for people that were hearing that math calculation and wondering, well, what does that actually look like practically? Well, when you find out how much your life cost on a monthly basis, you multiply that times 12, right? And you're going to get my life cost this over a year. Is it $40,000 a year? Is it 50? Is it 60? Great. Whatever it is it $100,000 a year is what my life actually costs? It's just, what does it cost to maintain your lifestyle, and multiply that times 25. So if your life costs $40,000 a year, you would need multiply times 25. You're going to need $1 million. If it's $50,000 a year, you're going to need $1.25 million. If it's $60,000 a year, you need $1.5 million. You see the trend here. See where this is going. $80,000 a year, $2 million. We can keep going. You can pick. There's no judgment on what your annual expenses need to be. It's just a math calculation. Find out how much your life costs on an annual basis and multiply that on your calculator times 25. And that will give you, as Brad said, this 4% rule of thumb, a fantastic planning tool to start with in terms of what are we going to need? What are we going to need to target? And may I just say, it's way more accurate than what these retirement calculators on the internet are telling you going to need, because they're all based around your income. And Brad, this is one of your greatest soapbox of all time hits is by definition, if you're saving money, you don't need to replace your income, because at some point you're going to stop saving money. You're going to start spending it. So why would you try to save to a number to account for all the saving you are doing? Like, you're going to be working decades too long potentially in order to pull that off. And I just think that is kind of worth pointing out here. It's a rule of thumb, but it's way more accurate than any retirement calculator that you're seeing on the internet right now. Okay. Let's start building on this. So we now know our number. We are at, ground zero, and we have got potentially, in many cases, we've got some work to do just to get to a $0 net worth. So we're going to take some action. So in terms of checkpoints of financial independence, Brad and I were just kind of thinking through some of those early actions. Depending on where you're starting, something that comes to mind is that first point at which you're taking advantage of your employer match. For people that have not been on the path, have not thought about financial independence at all, this is a massive checkpoint where you're actually engaging in the financial system and you're actually getting your full paycheck that you are owed by your employer. They set up an arrangement, and if you're opting out of this, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and Jonathan, this is a 401k match, right? For people who are brand new, they might not even know what a match is, right? So this is in many private employers, you have a 401k retirement plan. Obviously, there are different types of retirement plans, but 401k is the most common. And your employer tries to incentivize you by offering a match. So if you save, let's say, 6% of your income, will match you, really, really great ones we'll match you dollar for dollar, right? So we'll give you another 6%. That's 6% of your salary completely free, right? So in most cases it's not quite that generous. That's maybe it's 25% or 50%, or hey, we'll match you up to the first 2% of your salary. But rest assured, this is part of your salary that if you are not contributing to your 401k, you are throwing away. You're just saying to your employer, I don't really want my full salary, so I'll pass basically. So yeah, this is a nice checkpoint because this is something that really anybody with a 401k match can get started on today.
All right. So if you have participated in your employer match, whether you already were doing it or you took action on this, check it off. If you're making a worksheet, give yourself credit for that. It's massive. You are now fully leveraging, probably one of the most important benefits that your employer gives you if they offer that. And this is just, yeah, I mean, it works for you. It compounds for you. It's a big deal. Now, before this, after this, at the same time, these checkpoints don't need to proceed necessary in a linear fashion, but once you do them, you should give yourself credit. Do you have some form of an emergency fund, a crisis fund, a life is lumpy fund, Brad? I mean, whatever you want to call this, do you have a way to handle road bumps that life throws at you? Road bump, man, I'm mixing metaphors. I can't help myself, but do you have a way of handling a lumpy life?
Lumpy road bumps. Come on.
Yeah. That's the only type we have here in Virginia.
Yeah, Jonathan, emergency fund. It's funny because this is something we've talked about a lot here on the podcast. And I think while we can argue about the semantics of emergency fund, I think for anybody getting started on the path to financial independence, emergency fund is something that will be just familiar to them, right? That's a financial term you hear often. And I think any way you slice it, you need to have money saved up, regardless of where that is, no matter what you call it. There's more advanced stuff, and we can talk about that in a sequel to this episode. But it's really irrelevant for people getting started. You need to have money saved up because, again, life is lumpy. Things happen, right? Like you might just have a $500 expense come up, and if you don't have $1,000 in an emergency fund, then that just normal life expense becomes an emergency, right? It becomes a hair on fire situation if you have to get a loan or put it on your credit card for something that was entirely foreseeable, right? Like that's the rub here. It's like, this is not an emergency. It's just, hey, life happens sometimes, right? So you need to be prepared. So that's why having, again, no matter what we want to call it, an emergency fund, having money saved up with the ability to tap for just normal life expenses, it's really, really important.
If we're going to actually build on that, so we kind of framed it. A crisis fund is literally, could you handle like $1,000 expense? And then you can expand off of that, and people put all sorts of frameworks around it. Could you do 3 months of expenses? Could you do 6 months of expenses? That's really moving outside the scope of this. I'd say for the purposes of this checkpoint, do you have $1,000 that you could cover a flat tire? You could cover a broken appliance. You could cover some. It's just quite literally that simple. Once we get past that, now it's a more complicated conversation about not just do you have an emergency fund, but where is your emergency fund? How are you handling a 3-month expense? How are you handling a 6-month loss of income? These sorts of things. And this is why we have whole episodes dedicated to do you need an emergency fund? Where should your emergency fund be? How can you best optimize it? And it's a much more nuanced conversation. But as a checkpoint, a crisis fund. Do you have $1,000 that you could cover? Do you have $1,000 with no other names attached to it that you could go to if you need it? It's a checkpoint. If you always have that there, you can check that off the list and we'll move on. This is another checkpoint that I think for those of us that are coming through the system, like myself and most of my peers, we appreciate. And it is that point where your net worth gets back to zero. Now, there's some exclusions that I personally in my own mind have. I don't look at a mortgage as part of this at all, but I do include student loan debt. And and some people might not, so there's a little nuance even there, but I certainly include credit card, consumer debt, car payments, etc. And so this doesn't have to do so much with what's actually in your bank account, but it is a net balance of assets to liabilities. And so excluding your mortgage, but potentially, at least in my case, it was including my student loans. And maybe for other individuals, you might choose to leave that out or not. probably depending on how scary your student loan balance is. For me, even with my scary student loan balance, it was I took my student loans, I took credit card bills if I had those, things that I was financing, and I lumped them all together because I knew I wanted to pay them off. That's the real key here. I was trying aggressively early in my path to financial independence to pay them off. And I was also, as best I can, doing my employer match, trying to max out my 401k to whatever degree I was able at a point in time. And those things were happening, in tandem. Liabilities are going down, assets are going up. Neither of those is necessarily super spectacular, but at some point in time, my assets counteracted my liabilities and I had a $0 net worth. And in my late 20s, I was back to broke for the first time and well over a decade since engaging with the college system and taking on student loan debt. And it was a massive deal. And I think if you're tracking your net worth, which we'll talk about in just a second, it's something that you can watch for and get very, very excited about. Brad, I know the term's never really made sense to you, but it's kind of a negative. I'm back to broke. I've always was very excited because I had a negative net worth, even though my 401k was doing something. I had a negative net worth for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a day of celebration. There's no question about it. And yeah, so many people who find us, who find the FI community, are starting at a huge negative. So like you said, every action you take, whether that's paying down your debts or saving, it's all that's the cool part about this is it's all getting you closer to that zero, right? So when you look at it holistically in terms of that net worth, then clearly paying down a debt is getting you closer. Without any question, that is a positive thing. So yeah, when you get to that zero, I mean, Jonathan, that is a day of celebration. I remember when you paid off your loans. That was a remarkable
We
thing.
were recording this show, 4 years
Yeah,
ago. It was part of the early Choosify experience. As I
yeah.
got to that broke point and I got to that, pay off all the student loan debt point, which actually was, if you were thinking about it, I didn't have it on here, but it's another checkpoint. All of your debts, excluding your mortgage, are paid off. Now, where is that? We could try to structure that perfectly, but it's going to be different for different people. But just realize getting back to broke probably happens ahead, getting back to broke in terms of a net calculation of assets to liabilities is going to happen ahead of paying off all of your debt, excluding your mortgage. And so when you have actually paid off all of your debt, that's another potential checkpoint to financial independence. And if I were going to add just one more, just little flavor on here, when you're tracking that, it actually points out to you that paying off debt with high interest rates works the same way for net worth calculations as getting that same return in the positive. So for instance, if you have credit card debt with 18, 28% interest rate, somewhere in that range, and you pay that off, it's the exact same as if you made a 28% return on that money. And it's just very important to realize that for most people, compound interest is working against them constantly. What we are trying to quickly do is to get compound interest to work for us. And so understanding how the nature of the debts that we have, what are the interest rates, how does those interest rates accrue, and paying that off aggressively is a big piece of this puzzle for us. So we're going to keep going. I just wanted to point out, here's another one. And it's going to be really helpful for us as we start to get a more complicated financial picture. How do you track your net worth? I mean, Brad, already we discussed this individual had their employer match. So they've got their 401k. They're starting to lean into their 401k. We're going to talk about some other investment assets, but they maybe have student loan balances that they're paying down. At some point, it's going to be really helpful to get a dashboard away for us to actually track our progress and see it in real time. And I know that you did a version of this, I believe, on Excel, and I guess people could replicate a version of that, but I'll share the way that I've done this as well in just a second.
Yeah, I think there's the low tech way and there's the slightly more high tech way. And unsurprisingly, I take the low tech way. So for me, yeah, it's just I track my financial life just in a really, really simple Excel sheet. You could do it on Google spreadsheets really, really easily. And yeah, I just kind of track what are my accounts, like where are all of my assets, where are all my liabilities, and then pretty much what income's coming in and what expenses are going out. And I don't spend a ton of time on this. As we've talked about, I try to spend 10 or 15 minutes a month on my finances. So this really does kind of automate itself to a large degree. But I do, in fairness, I do take about an hour or so every quarter and just kind of update my financial statements, if you will. Again, that's my kind of crazy accountant's brain built into this, that I have to have this. But it's kind of cool looking and seeing your net worth grow over years and potentially decades. Like it's pretty cool to have that every quarter for the last 10 or 15 years. So yeah, that's how I do it. And Jonathan, you do a slightly more high tech version, but it's not terribly complicated by any means.
Yeah, I actually asked for Brad's low tech version for the community at one point. He was willing to share it, and I just decided as soon as I saw it, it was unusable for anyone else. So there's two different
Yeah.
strategies. If you're going to go Brad's quote unquote low tech version, one is just to make one yourself, like follow a YouTube tutorial or something and make one on your own, or go into the Choosify community and just ask if anybody has like a net worth calculator that they could share that you could just, and there's some really good ones inside of our community. If you want to take the approach that I've been using since probably 2009, 2010, I set up Personal Capital. I've absolutely loved this software, and I have like 10, 12, 15 years of data now. And just kind of be able to track your net worth over time. We did a whole review article to talk about it. You can find more information at choosify.com/PC, but you're able to bring in all of your retirement accounts, and you can bring in a lot of your debts as well, and just watch. And it works in my mind, even though they will tell you that it works for budgeting too. I have never, and probably would never really use it for budgeting. I use it strictly as a net worth calculator, and it does that exceedingly well. So as we start thinking about now, all right, so we set up some sort of net worth tracker, whether that be a low tech Excel option or something, like Personal Capital. Now we're actually starting to kind of flex a little bit, and we're getting some additional accounts teed up. So maybe one of these checkpoints is the first year you maxed out your 401k. Now, I will say that these checkpoints, I just want to make sure people understand they are not like, you don't need to necessarily do all of them. I think, Brad, you actually reached financial independence. You've heard you say this before, and I always found it fascinating. You never a single year maxed out your 401k on your path to financial independence. Was that accurate?
Yeah, no, that's true. And yeah, I mean, it was just a lack of knowledge, honestly, at that point. I mean, that predated this podcast. It predated a lot of things that I've learned over the last 5 to 10 years. So, yeah, I never maxed out my 401k. That said, I mean, I certainly saved more than the amount of money that would have been maxing out the 401k. But for whatever reason, I just did not do that, and that cost me. I've never gone back and done the calculation, but that would have been a tax deduction in each of those years, and I just basically threw it away. So yeah, I think that's why clearly everybody's situation is different. We're not advising you necessarily just in a vacuum to max out your 401k is 100% of the time going to be the right decision. But for many people in high tax brackets, Jonathan, maxing out your 401k is a great way to have real significant control over your tax liability. So, I mean, that comes right off the top. That's the concept of marginal taxation, right? Which is the way the US tax system is set up. So, if you're in, a significant bracket, again, that comes up right off the top. So, at the highest marginal rate that you pay. So, that's why maxing the 401k is for many people a very smart decision.
And now, as we start to do this, we are really quickly approaching real stages, real things that you can point at. Like, for instance, if you were to have this on your check sheet, you reached a 5-figure net worth in your investment accounts, and we could be talking about your 401k in this case. We could be talking about another one that we're going to layer onto this. But when you get to a 5-figure net worth in your investment accounts, that is a really, really big deal. You might want to make note of that and just congratulate yourself for a second.
Yeah, and Jonathan, just again just clarify a little bit, 5-figure net worth is just, do I have $10,000 or more? Right? That's, you literally write that number down there, 5 digits there. So yeah, that's what we mean, and that is a big deal, right? Like, for the very first time, you have $10,000 to your name, and that's a huge thing.
Yeah, and it's almost interesting to even think about, regardless of where this is, what does that mean in terms of, we talked about this starting out with this emergency fund or this crisis fund. I just want to point out, you become kind of immune to a lot of emergencies when you have a net worth. Now, it's not to say you want to go tackle this $10,000 that you've saved up, but I just want to point out, as we build on this, life has to throw a lot more at you to put you in the same state of stress that you would have been when you didn't have this. Because you do have options. Now, it may not be great options to go into your 401k and grab 10K out of there. In fact, it's a horrible option. But it is a fundamentally different perspective than not having savings. So just please consider that as we kind of layer on additional stuff here. Now, I wanted to point out we talked about the 401k, and Brad actually said I did not max out my 401k, but I was saving in other vehicles. That really comes to some of the other checkpoints. That point in time, here's a checkpoint that you open up for the first time a Roth IRA and you fund a Roth IRA. There's some additional friction there. That is another account that you can use with some unique benefits for individuals that has some tax advantage properties to it that you should be aware of. Now, this is not an episode that we're dedicating to that, but if you have funded or opened a Roth and there's any money in there, that is a checkpoint. If you have maxed out a Roth, you should certainly give yourself credit for a checkpoint. Again, depending on your individual tax situation, you may or may not do all of these, but you should just be aware it's hard to overstate the friction to getting these things started, as opposed to once you've started them, how relatively easy it is to add additional money. And that is why just being aware of them and looking into what would be involved to get it started is a massive, massive piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, and I think that what you just said at the end there, being aware of it and taking action, right? For some people, we could talk about a bunch of different accounts, right? We could talk about an
Well,
HSA
we
for
are. If
health
you're going to
savings.
rob me of that, I was going to quickly
I,
breeze through those. And you want to
I
just go
am
ahead and
going to
do it
rob
right
you.
now?
No, but it's important. Because really not everything, and we want to make this clear here, is that you don't have to check all these boxes. Jonathan, you said this 30 minutes ago, and it's important to reiterate, like, just because these are little checkpoints, it doesn't mean it's going to fit into everybody's life, right? Like, you might have the greatest health insurance plan in the world at your job where you pay $5 a month in premiums, right? So getting an HSA, going on your own, getting a high deductible plan, and just so you can have an HSA would make no sense, right? It would make absolutely no sense whatsoever. So for you, in that bizarre hypothetical that I just set up, that person could never check the box for HSA as long as they're at that company. And does that mean that something went wrong in their path to find? No, of course not. They're crushing it, right? So these kind of things. Now, Jonathan, I will stop stealing your thunder and let you go back to your
It's
little list
good.
here.
And to
But
be honest, you did steal a little bit of my HSA thunder, but I mean, I think it is appropriate to point that out. But I will just add, and it was the reason it was going to be farther down, your 401k, perhaps your Roth IRA to a slightly lesser degree, and also your taxable accounts, getting all of these three set up and figuring out where you want them to be. It's an important part because we're going to be using all of these over time as we, increase our income, as we create more space, as we have more bandwidth and margin in our life. We're going to be using these three financial tools with significantly increasing frequency. And to your point, well said, the HSA should be on your radar, but not all of these are going to be on everybody's individualized financial independence plan. So, but I wanted to make sure the tools are there and people recognize literally getting the account started and knowing how to go in and fund it. You should give yourself credit for that because so many people wake up 30 years later and have never done it. And the difference between $1 million in their bank account and nothing was just that point of friction. How can we create an autopilot scenario? Well, it starts with getting the account started. So, as humble as it is, let's do those and let's check ourselves off. What are the accounts that you have? Do you have a 401k? Do you have a Roth? Do you have a taxable account? Yes. Do you have an HSA? And if you have all of those or some of those, are you tracking those in your net worth tracker? That's a big deal because as we started to celebrate this person that has $10,000 in their investments, well, is it all in one account? Is it spread through four of those accounts? It's the aggregation of those accounts that we're using to give ourselves credit for the different stages that we're about to get to.
yeah, and Jonathan, a taxable account for anybody just listening to this for the first time, that's a very fancy way of saying it's just your regular investment accounts. Nobody's really come up with a better way of saying it other than taxable account, but just think of it as, hey, this is the money. It's not in any type of retirement account or anywhere special. It's just the money that theoretically it might be in your checking account or your savings account. Well, that money you could open up an investment account at M1 Finance or Vanguard or Fidelity or Schwab, wherever, and you can invest it into stocks, bonds, mutual funds, whatever. And that the fancy way of saying that people call it a taxable account. And yeah, I just wanted to clarify because that is like it's an odd thing. And yeah, maybe someday we'll come up with we'll lock down the terminology for that.
I think the whole idea of taxable account, one of the things that people almost, when they hear that, the visceral reaction is, well, maybe I should just keep it in my savings account because I don't want my
Right.
money to be
That sounds
taxed.
bad.
But you don't make like you're not paying taxes on the money that you put in. You're paying taxes on the growth, right? So if your $10,000 turns into $40,000 over a period of time, and you were to then pull all of that money out, you would have $10,000 that you put in and $30,000 of growth, and that $30,000 would then be taxable. Contrast that with your $10,000 you put in a savings account for the 10 years or whatever, and now it's worth I don't know,
10,050.
10,500,
Yeah.
10,050. Okay. It's still taxable, by the way. Actually, I should just point out, right? That gain is still taxable, but it just didn't do anything. So don't be afraid of the word taxable. We want our money to earn money for us. We will be using taxable accounts. That's not a bad thing. And there's a bunch of examples. We'll have some links in the show notes for kind of different places to look. But most of the traditional financial institutions that you would think of have some way to invest in a taxable account. I think we're going into pure stages now. A lot of these were just important to think through what gets us there, but now we're really starting to look for like these are quantitative measures so that when we get to this point, it tells us something about what our initial goal was to reach financial independence. So I'm going to start with just this one real quick because we should get there in relatively short order if we've gotten all the other stuff done. And that is a six-figure net worth. You have $100,000 plus in your bank account. Now, it could have taken several years to do that, and a lot of people say the first 100,000 is the hardest. But when you get to 100,000, there's just, I mean, it's like your money really starts making money for you. And while it was happening the whole time, the amount of money that your money is making for you when it's in your investment accounts, it starts to feel a lot more tangible. I mean, you're talking about potentially a scenario where thousands of dollars a month are being created potentially. And certainly thousands and thousands of dollars a year are showing up on your return, maybe on any year, but certainly on the good years. It's like, wow. I mean, I kind of just, it's almost like I got a raise at this point. And for those of you that are using a net worth tracker like Personal Capital, you're probably going to start getting phone calls. And that, my friends, when you start getting phone calls from Personal Guy, and I'm not asking the Choosify group, what to do when you start getting phone calls, and they will give you a very, very robust answer. I'm just telling you, for those of you that have Personal Capital accounts, you're going to start getting phone calls. And that, my friends, can be one of your checkpoints. I got my phone call. So just be aware of that. But Brad, really, the six-figure net worth, we're moving towards some of these advanced stages. And the one that I wanted to point out, especially for those individuals that got started early, and I mean this now as an age, early on there, in terms of your life, there are young people, there's young adults, there's adults, and then there's older adults, right? But when you are a young adult, making these moves and acquiring significant net worth early on in life, there is a stage of FI that we talk about that I think is very worth mentioning at this point in time. And I'll give this one back to you.
Yeah, this is COSFI. So as I think about this, and Jonathan, I'd be curious if there's any distinction in your head, because that's kind of the cool thing about these, right? It's like these are all in the eye of the beholder to a large degree. But I see COSFI as okay, I have saved dramatically, right? Like I've been on the path to FI. And actually I would even push back and saying, sure, this is dramatically easier if you do start early. But theoretically, COSFI could apply to anyone no matter what their age, in theory, though it is much easier for someone who's younger. So let's say hypothetically you start, everything's right, you have no student loan debt, you start at 22 saving a boatload of money. By the time you're 28, you've got, I don't know, $300,000 saved up, right? Your savings rate has been unbelievable. And that 300,000 is going to grow over the years and decades. We would expect if you got an 8% annual return, that your investments would double every 9 years. That's kind of a loose rule of thumb. You could do the math. It's the rule of 72 if you wanted to really look it up. But so anyway, every 9 years. So at 28, you'd have 300 grand. At 37, you would have 600 grand. At 46, you'd have 1.2 million. That money is working on its own, right? And then the concept of coast fi is that, hey, once you've gotten to that point, you can just kind of coast along. You need to basically just earn enough money that you can cover your expenses. So you don't need that massive savings rate anymore. You can just cover what you've got and just coast. So 0% savings rate, all the while in that background, in my example here, that 300 grand at 28 is just steamrolling along. And hey, if you want to work and coast for 20 years, that money is going to double 2+ times. And like I said, be well over $1 million. And at that point, you might be at fi, depending on what your expenses are. So yeah, that, Jonathan, coast fi is something that intuitively appeals to me. I like that one.
Yeah, as I kind of try to think about this as a parent, helping my kids with various targets with the benefit of the information I have now, I kind of in my mind have this goal of how can we look at the financial choices they make between now and 25, or you said 28, kind of in that range. Basically, the time that I was graduating school was 6 figures of student loan debt. How can we look at that same window of time and position them to have a 6 figure net worth by 25 to 28? So around $100,000 net worth by right around the age of 25. And I think the steps are pretty clear based on what we know now about skill-based training, getting jobs, not going significantly into debt. I mean, if you can get an above median income at the age of 17, 18, 19 years old without having to dedicate 4 years to college and without having to go massively into student loan debt to get said degree, to get that job, if you can just start earning that incredible income right out the gate. And I'm not saying don't go to college. I'm just saying if you can cash flow it, or if you could be making money the whole time, becomes a relatively easy process. If you have given yourself, 10 years to earn 100K, I mean, just even on a cash flow basis, that's very doable. If you have investments working for you, that's beyond doable. And I think that if you set your kid up like that, they could just basically be paycheck to paycheck for the rest of their life. And they're going to have a much better retirement than people that have been saving money from the age of 35 to 65. It's just incredible how time works on your side. And so that's kind of like one of the ways, if you start these money lessons with your kids younger. We had a whole episode around how to make your kid a millionaire. This kind of builds on that concept and kind of adds some strategy to that. But coast-fi gives us a framework. And Brad, you rightly push back, because my bias is thinking through how can I invest my energy and a lot of my communication around working with my son and daughter to help them realize this if they want to do that. It is just a math calculation. So you could say, hey, I'm a 35-year-old, I'm a 45-year-old, I've been industrious, I've saved. What is the amount that if I just were to like take a gap year, or were just to not worry about saving, but just spending everything, but not drawing down on my investments, but I don't need my investments, I just don't need to save anymore. What would that number be at a traditional retirement age? And if you're happy with that number, if it looks a lot like your FI number, then you've reached coast FI. A different framework of what I was initially visualizing, but you're right to push back and just point out that it's just an equation. So coast FI. Now, continuing to go here, Brad, you actually pointed this out earlier, and I'm good with this as well, is this idea of half FI. And if we provided a definition earlier about financial independence being 25 times annual expenses. I'll let you counter that by describing half FI.
Yeah, I guess not too big of a leap here to just assume that it is quite literally half of that. So instead of 25 times your annual expenses, it's 12 and a half times. So that, I guess maybe that math calculation isn't quite as rolling off the tongue, but just really simply, you take your FI number and you just cut it in half, right? So you've already done the math of, hey, what is 25 times? Well, then obviously half of that is 12 and a half times. So if your FI number is $1 million, you've reached half FI at $500,000 net worth. So yeah, that to me, this is nothing changes, Jonathan. It's not like that coast FI, which again, I told you, that intuitively appeals to me. Half FI is just this little checkpoint. It's, man, I am halfway there. But as you always say, you're way more than halfway, right? Because of the power of compounding.
That is exactly where I was going to go with that. Yeah. I mean, people need to realize that now and that's actually another point to look for, another like checkpoint to look for, is this crossover point. This is why when you're at half financial independence, you're actually, although at a net worth perspective, you're halfway there. from a timeline perspective, you're closer to 75% there, maybe even 80% there in some cases. And that is because you've reached something, and this is another thing, just something to watch for, this crossover point. You've gotten to a point in time where the compounding growth on your investments is accruing or showing up faster than the amount of money that you're contributing toward your investment. So let's say that you are contributing $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month, whatever whatever that is. When you check your investments on a monthly or an annual basis, on a monthly basis, your net worth is growing by, forget your actual investment, what your actual current investments are growing by in the absence of what you're contributing, they're growing by, $2,000 a month, $3,000 a month. As soon as they pass what you're actually contributing, you have reached a crossover point, and you can say that my money is working, harder than I am at this point going forward. It's working 24/7. You've reached the crossover point, and it's what continues to speed this thing up. So half fi is closer to 75 or 80% in some cases of the way to financial independence. And when you notice that, please give yourself credit for that point, that your investments grew by more than your contributions. And it's really hard to overstate how powerful that is. And it actually points us pretty handily to the next stage, which goes back to how much does my life cost? And it is this idea, and Brad, this is the one that if we go very back to the beginning with this initial question, and Snowbird Fi and everything else, there was one that we had a lot of fun with a while back that we got from a Lynn, and I'll give this back to you. It was burger flipping Fi, and I'll let you kind of explain that, and we can talk around what that meant to us at the time and what it means now.
Yeah, so I guess this is probably a close analog of barista-fi, right? Would you say that's
Yeah, I
somewhat
think
fair?
I think it's the heart of it. Maybe Barista Fi was just more brandable. I just like Burger Flipping Fi because it's just fun. But
Yeah,
maybe,
there's some je ne sais quoi there.
yeah,
Burger flipping fi, I like that. Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I guess this probably. How would you distinguish burger flipping fi from coast fi? I think that would probably be the starting point here.
yeah, that's a great question. I think more it's the mentality. So I very much associated Coast Fi with this in my version of it. It was something that I was focusing on for young adults, right? It was like it's an intensity that points to a fact when you get here, you can lay off the gas. And Burger Flipping Fi is the same thing, but basically what Burger Flipping Fi says is I could go get a job making minimum wage, or I could pick a job not based on the money at all. And if I just bring in that, I would be at plus what I'm drawing down on my accounts. I would be able to have the exact same lifestyle I have now. So whereas CoastFi is more of a net mechanism of I'm just not going to save anything anymore. Burger flipping fi is I'm at a point where I could pick a job that I want, not based on the money. And we could say it's flipping burgers, or let's get more creative. It's becoming a scuba dive instructor off the coast of some island. And, it only pays a very, very fractional amount, but you've got the work that you've done up to this point to subsidize the difference. And you're going to be able to have a fantastic life. It's the Mexican fisherman approach to fi.
Right. Or working for that nonprofit that you always wanted to, or just doing what you want regardless of what it costs. So okay, so that is the distinction between CoastFi is, hey, you're still at that same job and you're not saving any money anymore. But whereas burger flipping fi or barista fi or whatever we want to call it, you're making a much smaller amount of money, and you are, like you said, you're drawing down potentially on some of your net worth. So it's this hybrid of,
Yep.
hey, I'm kind of at fi, but I'm not all the way there, and I still want to earn a little bit of money. Maybe I'm getting health insurance from wherever I'm working, So I think that's how I think about it in my head is exactly how you just described it. Is all right, it doesn't matter what I earn, but I do need to earn a little bit here. And, any ancillary benefits certainly help, obviously, as well. But I am most likely drawing down on my assets going along the lines of the 4% rule. So it really is that hybrid method of not quite a fi, but it's not a coast fi. That's what distinguishes it for me.
Yeah. if we expand on that and we actually build the next layer of this, this is where people talk about lean fi. And this is why, going back to the early exercise, it was important to know how much your life costs, because there's how much does my life cost, like just in a drift state. And then if you were to kind of look through that and be able to separate out the expenses between, well, how much does my life cost if I pay off my cars? How much does my life cost if we don't go out to eat 3 times a week? How much does my life, like, what are my structural expenses? What are my obligations that I could pay off? And then what are my consumption based expenses that really aren't bringing value that I could cut? And if you come up with different variations of your budget and you come up with this survival budget, like, you got to cover your core needs, right? And what does that budget actually look like? I'm not saying it's ideal, but wouldn't it be cool if you knew that you have a net worth that doing, financial independence calculations around could cover Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yeah, I like this lean fi. So, right, this is cutting out any of the extraneous stuff. It doesn't mean you're eating rice and beans, but you're cutting out the significantly extraneous stuff. And this is more of a mental construct, Jonathan. I don't think anybody's really aspiring to this, right? Like, am I going to sit in my house and watch Netflix all day, and not go out or not travel or not whatever it is, right? Like, so to me, it's more of a mindset of, hey, if I absolutely needed to, I could. And in fairness, that that was a limiting belief with the Netflix thing, because people can have wonderful lean fi lives. So I don't mean to I guess that's probably how I think of it in my own head. But it's hey, can I be fi, right? Can I be fi based on just the backbone of my life? And I think there's something very reassuring about that. And like we always say, you're almost invariably going to make some money. You're almost invariably going to, there's a little margin here. So, this is not just sitting and doing nothing, like I kind of mockingly said a minute ago, but the mental construct of, can I reach this point of fi, without all that extra stuff? And then you get into, Jonathan, we're going to talk about the extra stuff in a minute, right? Because then there's polar opposites that, the last stage is that fat fi, which is, hey, let's just blow up the budget. Let's just keep adding stuff in. So I think lean fi is just kind of the opposite, just a little bit on that other side of fi as fat fi is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a continuum, and these are stages. These are for you to give yourself credit. If your goal was lean fi, that's one thing. But in terms of acknowledging my net worth is past this point, like, that's pretty cool to know that you can cover all of your core expenses for the rest of time. And we left one off, which I kind of feel a little bad about because I leaned on this personally, but it's FU money. And we kind of define that generally as having a couple years worth of expenses saved up. So if your life costs, $30,000-$40,000 a year, maybe this is when your net worth is starting to approach the 60 to 80K range, maybe closer to 100K, somewhere in that range. But I mean, this is when, I have some period of time before I really need to go try to figure out how to cover those core expenses. I'm good to go. I've got some margin. I could retrain into a different industry. I could start my own business. I could pivot and go across the street. I don't need to say yes to unreasonable demands from an employer or corporation that doesn't appreciate me. And we just had an episode where we saw that. I personally leveraged FU money, and I think FU money is another one that, when you recognize you have that, it's going to change the way you negotiate for your salary. It's going to change the requests that you make. It's going to change a lot about your working environment. And so just that was one I think we should park earlier up there as well. I would make that adjustment and post if I could. We'll keep going though, and these are going to just rapidly speed up because they become more obvious. That's why most people are on the path to fi, right? So adding some flavor to, what you should be aware of, giving yourself credit for that, gamifying it, building your checklist. But now that we've done all of those, or we've accomplished those, we are now at the point where we're looking at financial independence. Did I hit my number? And then from there, you could even go farther. And we've already talked about how to calculate financial independence, but there's a whole group of people that say, well, financial independence is like living my life the way I live it right now. What if I never wanted, like I wanted to, increase my spending by 30% or double my lifestyle or whatever? What does that actually look like? And they call this fat fi. Fat fi. And it's just a continuum of financial independence. It goes to, what do you want? And is there any, fun ways to actually account for that? I think Leaf, Physician on Fire, he just basically added effectively another 20 to 25% onto his financial independence number. Or he came up, and this was kind of my little play on this. He calculated his financial independence number around a mortgage. So your mortgage is $1,000 a month, $2,000 a month, whatever it is, and then just pay off your mortgage. And so your financial independence was calculated around an expense that you no longer have. It automatically builds that buffer. And so that's maybe a way that I account for, fat fi without actually having to figure out, anything, any particular magic math on the other side. But it's a continuum. No one is actually telling you that you have to stop your job when you reach financial independence. But if that was one of the reasons you wanted to reach financial independence, then, well, someone should probably give you credit for walking away, making the choice to step away and start the next chapter, in which case maybe that should also be on your stages of financial independence. I'm living my post-fi life, or I'm building my post-fi life right now. So I hope, Brad, I'll give you kind of final word on that, but I hope to our audience that kind of gives them a framework for just how fun this journey can be and things to watch for along the way. What would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I like how you described it as that continuum, right? Because this really is for everybody, and that's the nice thing. There's some people who just that fat fi that is their ultimate aspiration, right? And I get that. I mean, I think we can all understand that appeal, right? Like, hey, I'm gonna I'm gonna get to that point where forget 25 times my expenses. I want to have 35 times my current expenses because I want to do all the things, right? Like I don't want to ever have to think about money again. So, and there are obvious trade-offs, right? Like for that person, that might mean working a couple extra years. That might mean having a higher savings rate, whatever it is, right? Like, or then you have somebody who, hey, the lean fi is what appeals to me. And I really want to get to that point, and that is my goal. And I think that's kind of cool. Is that while people love to set up these kind of arbitrary little arguments or fights or whatever online, like I don't see anything that should say like, oh, I'm lean-fi or oh, I'm barista-fi, and like we all kind of retreat into our corners, right? Like that's ridiculous. This is a community, an open community of people who are just trying to live better lives. And I think, like we said here, this starts on day one of your FI journey, all the way up to that fat FI of, hey, I've got 100 times my annual expenses, and I'm gonna go buy a super yacht and donate tens of millions of dollars to charity, right? Like that's great too. Like all the better. But it starts on day one for all of us. And yeah, Jonathan, this was a lot of fun.
I hope our audience takes this up. People are in a lot of financial pain. A lot more people are in hair and fire scenarios this time this year than there were just a couple of years ago. And while this is not get rich quick, this does give people the best chance of building a better life just based on fundamentals. Get a rock solid fundamental game in place. So let's do our part, just help our friends and family navigate this, trying time in life, and see if all of us can, start making aggregational marginal gains, these marginal improvements, start making them day by day, week by week, and let's see what we can build together. All right, my friends, the fire is spreading. We'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.